One area that can be very useful in dealing with differences in culture is to adapt or translate instruments for screening and diagnosis, as well as outreach materials. There is an absence of good literature on translation and cultural adaptation of tools. Very commonly, you'll read something in an academic journal and say, we had to adapt this tool to our work in Egypt or Israel or wherever it might be. But they don't tell you what they adapted or how they figured out that it should be adapted. And so we really need more information about this because people want to use instruments that are in the native language of the people that they are studying, or even if it's in the same language, is there a way to make that tool more culturally appropriate? And one set of studies that really needs to be done is whether the translation or adaptation of outreach materials has any kind of measurable effect on whether or not underserved communities, communities in which there is an underdetection of autism, will be seeking out more initial evaluations or taking up referrals for early intervention. I also, though, need as a caveat to say that one should never assume that major adaptations to an instrument are necessary. And one of the problems in the literature is that we don't have evidence of how people determine the failure of an instrument. An instrument ought to fail before you fiddle around with it. And often people make an assumption that they need to do something different, saying, oh, in the ADOS kit, the birthday cake won't work in Kenya, without seeing if it, in fact, does. Other questions, though, that need to be asked of the community that you're working with. What are the developmental milestones in that community? Not every community will follow what the CDC says is its set, or the APA, the American Academy of Pediatrics, says is the time of different milestones. At what level of impairment or what level of problem warrants action in a particular community? How do people negotiate between multiple healthcare systems, where you have herbal medicines and traditional doctors and religious healers and biomedical care and other forms of healing? How do they figure out what to do first and how to pair them together? What do they keep secret and what do they reveal? Do people have a model of the idiopathic? Since typically the Western clinician is going to give an explanation that's rather idiopathic. We don't know why this happened, but now that we know what happened, let's deal with it. Well, how does that fit into a community that always does have an explanation for everything? To what degree is the child distinct from its family or larger social context? In some communities in sub-Saharan Africa, if there's a problem with the child, it is thought not to be a problem contained within the child, but rather a problem of the community that is represented or expressed through the child. The child is a representative of something wrong with the family. And is there a concept of a pattern? So a lot of parents may not immediately understand that when you're asking about 10 different types of behaviors, that there's any relationship between them. One of the things that I've also noted in my own work on translation and adaptation of instruments in South Africa and in the United States for the Korean population in the US and for Zulu-speaking groups in South Africa is that translation is exceedingly difficult. And just because somebody's a native speaker doesn't mean they're going to do a good translation. Translation is one of the hardest things to do in all of the study of literature's fiction and nonfiction. And the goal of translation should not be term equivalence, but rather how do you communicate effectively to a group of people? The best translation is one in which people look at it and they say, this isn't a translation. This was written by my community, for my community, and there's no evidence that, and imagine, people who are for whom English is their second language, who live in Canada or the United States, they can suss out a bad translation because they're so used to seeing translations at the Department of Motor Vehicles or in the educational system or whatever. And sometimes a translation of a document can be better than the original. I feel that way about the one I did for the Autism Speaks Foundation, where I took their 100 Days kit and translated it into Korean. But it took 12 months and interviews with 100 people to figure out how to translate it so that the exact wording and the phrasing and all of that was used in such a way that nobody would think that that was this guy, that was involved. So it was written by the community, for the community.